York, the jewel of the north, situated just below the Yorkshire moors and the dales. An ancient city. These days it's more famous for ghosts, stag nights and John Smith's bitter. But under your feet is a deep and rich history, full of Vikings, Romans and knights. So let's get stuck in to the history of York. As Roman rule in Britannia was drawing to a close, Magnus Maximus held position of general of the Roman army, a devout Christian from Portugal with ambitions of power. He's the one who in 383 gathered his armies when they were still stationed in Britannia and crossed into Gaul to strip the crown from Gratian, the emperor of the western part of the Roman Empire, usurping the throne and setting himself up as Caesar of Britain and Gaul. This might not be York, but it gives you a picture of what's going on in Britain and the general empire at the time. For it was a time of chaos, as raids from the Picts and the Saxons, as well as a whole host of others, were on the rise. Maximus was back the next year, fighting off these invaders. But by 388, he was off again, fighting elsewhere in the empire, and taking the army with him. While he was away, he entrusted his empire to various local leaders. The chap that's placed in charge of Eboracum, York, was Cole Hen, a character who's mainly famous in Brythonic legend. All we really know about what's going on in York in this time for sure is the presence of a bishop, going back to the early years of the 4th century, as there was a council in Gaul that recorded the presence of a bishop from the city of York, or Eboracum. Though this isn't a minster church, that won't be built for centuries yet. But it can be assumed that a bishop was around under Maximus also. The problem is, Maximus is crushed at the Battle of Sava and executed, leaving Britain leaderless, as Emperor Theodosius couldn't care less about Britain. Nor did his successor, Honorius. Now that was until around 406 AD, when the troops that had been left behind in England rebelled, crowning one of their own common soldiers as emperor, Constantine III. They'd not been paid in months and were disillusioned by the state of affairs. Right, this new so-called emperor took his army deep into the empire and fought his rebellion there. But all hell was breaking loose as Vandals, Franks, Saxons, Visigoths were all rising up. Rome was having her own troubles. Troops were needed to defend the centre of administration in Rome, and in 410 the capital was sacked by the Visigoths. That same year, Emperor Honorius sent a letter to both the cities of Britannica Superior and Inferior that the Romans were leaving, and the natives would have to look to their own defences. There would be no Roman control over Britain whatsoever. They simply abandoned the territory, letting it defend for itself. And Hadrian's Wall was abandoned. Arguably, the last stage of withdrawal occurred somewhere between 409 to 411, but it's 410 when the letters were sent, and that's the accepted date. Though I will add that these letters could easily be Honorius referring to his generals in Bruttium, southern Italy. After all, this was the fall of Rome, and the troops had pretty much left Britain by 388, decades ago. These were dark times indeed, and the barbarians were certainly at the gates. Then, all of a sudden, we had gone from being part of a huge empire spanning from the crags of Caledonia to the sands of Syria, to a localised, broken down economy. Hence, from now on, we'll no longer be dealing with far-off exotic lands, as our attention is drawn to localised affairs. As prior to all this, Eboracum was placed in the hands of Cole Hen. He appears to have declared himself ruler of Britannia Inferior at some point, but unfortunately so little is known. There is a reason people used to call this the Dark Ages, as written records fall silent, giving the impression that the civilization ran to an abrupt halt, which we know for certain it didn't. All that seems to have happened is a de-romanization of Britain. But to be fair, the Celtic tribes didn't truly Romanize for the most part. If anything, during the 4th century, they were culturally conquering the Romans. During this time, the archaeological evidence of Romans promptly vanishes, replaced by local customs, albeit Christian, not pagan. There was no more construction of Roman buildings, like aqueducts or baths. The 3 known baths in York succumbed to disrepair. No ceramics and no coinage. And the larger buildings, like villas, don't even appear to have been occupied, just abandoned, at least for the most part. No doubt gradually overgrown by nature. Other more rural buildings were still occupied, but dilapidated, falling to ruin. In their place appear wooden huts and other low-tech buildings more typical of this new era. Widespread trade of goods also runs to a complete standstill, becoming more localised. Caer Eboracum, as some sources call it, did have a kitchenware industry that managed to continue quite a while into the 5th century. But eventually, even this ceased trading. It seems buildings just got old and crumbled, people not having the knowledge or want to repair them, erecting wooden buildings instead. Some even speculate that the city of Caer Eboracum itself was abandoned for a brief period, a trend that certainly happened in many British towns. What actually happened? We may never know. Unfortunately, even archaeology cannot give us a definite answer. We don't even really know what happened to old tribes like the Brigantes or the Silures. Records just stop, and won't be picked up again until the middle of the 5th century, when the Saxons arrive. But even they wouldn't arrive in York until a little bit later on in the century. And it's murky how they got here in Britain in the first place. But the whole deal with Vortigern down in the south, with Hengist and Horsa, seems mythological, allegorical, delving more into Arthurian myth than historical reality. Either way, cemetery remains have been found that shows clear evidence that Saxons were in fact in York during this time, in the late 5th century, and they were not going away. And they called this city Jorvik. The Wick part, meaning a commercial centre, an emporium, suggesting that the city was back in the game as international trade began once again. The Saxons had divided Britain, by the way, into 4 domains: East Anglia, Wessex, Mercia and Northumbria. Jorvik was situated in the latter. Some of the old Roman roads were used, such as Coney Street and Stonegate. Others had fallen into such disrepair that building over them was the only logical choice, and the new roads crisscrossing all over the place. But we don't truly know whether this was a thriving city, or just pockets of settlements dotted around an abandoned Roman ruin. Going by some sources, the ruins were flooded, but other sources contradict that. We won't really be hearing about this Jorvik until the dawn of the 7th century. In Rome, things had stabilised. The empire in the west had long gone, replaced by various city-states with regional politics. But the church had established itself at the heart of all of this, so, from Rome, Pope Gregory decides to send an emissary to Britain to re-establish the church there. He chooses York to be the head of the church in the north. No doubt influenced by the first Christian emperor having been crowned in Eboracum all those years ago. This emissary, known as Paulinus, does just that, and starts the first Gregorian mission in the city, becoming the new bishop there, converting the Angles and the Saxons to Christianity. He even baptized a saint, St. Hilda of Whitby. Unfortunately, the scallywag doesn't tell us what he found upon arriving at York. Was it abandoned? Was it full of life? We don't know. Whatever the case, we do know that the local area, Northumbria, also known as Deira, had a king, King Edwin, and yep, Edwin was also persuaded to take up the cross of Christ. By now, Paulinus had moved further south, leaving his underling James the Deacon in charge of York, and eventually Paul himself would become a saint, passing away at Rochester in 644. That's the year, not his age, by the way. Finally, Britain was sorting itself out, as was York. The Venerable Bede, also from Northumbria, yep, he was a northerner, he made his way to Jorvik in the early 8th century, on a mission to meet with the King Ceolwulf and the Archbishop there. An archbishop? Yes, the city boasted a cathedral made of stone, complete with a grand altar and chandeliers. This church isn't technically the Minster we know today, as it was rebuilt after a fire, and buildings tended to get rebuilt under the Normans anyway. But it was consecrated in the 7th century. There we go. But this is a new age. It's looking distinctively medieval. Not quite at knights and castles yet, but you can see where it all began. Another figure appears in the mid-8th century, the York-born Alcuin. Another member of the clergy is also a scholar, and he gets invited overseas to the court of the king of the Franks, Charlemagne, where he made his name. So York, or Jorvik, is making a pretty good name for itself, having learned scholars wanted by foreign kings, and Alcuin would remain there until his later days. He'd pass away in Tours, modern-day France. York had international trade with peoples, Rhineland and Franks. But though this was a time of growth and religious stability, there were still troubles in the north. Northumbria was far from enjoying a time of peace. They were having a civil war. Ella of Northumbria had usurped the throne from Osberth, and all hell was breaking loose. But this would soon change, as there were stirrings in Scandinavia, the rise of the Vikings. It was the mid-8th century when Norse raiders first turned their eyes towards England, raiding monasteries like Lindisfarne, desecrating Christian relics and taking slaves. Lightning raids where they'd appear and be back on their ships before any resistance could be mustered, led by legendary figures like Ragnar Lothbrok. Raids that were becoming a huge problem. This is the Viking era, though, according to legend, Ragnar Lothbrok would die at the hands of that usurper, Ella. He's thrown into a pit of snakes. Alcuin, from the courts of Charlemagne, mentions the terror faced by the heathens from the icy north. The way they spilled the blood of the saints, they trampled the relics on the floor. For devout Christians, this was as if the end of times were truly upon the earth, And in 866, this escalated on a massive scale. The Danes were a different breed, ruthless, seasoned raiders like Ivar Ragnarsson, Guthrum, Ubba. This great heathen army, as it was dubbed, led by Ivar and Halfdan, crashed upon our shores like a tidal wave. Its goal was not one of mere raiding, but one of conquest, landing at East Anglia before heading north. York didn't stand a chance. King Aelle, faced with the Danish invasion, retreated, leaving Ivar and Ubba in control of the city. Then, making peace with his rival Osberth, Aelle tries to drive the Danes from York. But they're both defeated, and both Saxon kings died in the battle. The Danes at this point didn't want to rule personally. They simply installed a puppet king, Egbert, and left York. Wulfhere, the archbishop, made peace and was allowed to remain with the cathedral. See, the Vikings aren't that bad. Anyway, job done. Ivar and Ubba continue their campaign in the north and the Midlands, returning to York for a winter before relocating to Thetford, in what would become a long, drawn-out 14-year war with the Saxons. The deals were made, alliances were struck and broken. In the south, Alfred the Great tries a truce, but is driven out into the marshes of Somerset. However, in the south, the Vikings enjoy limited success, before the Saxons eventually claim their territory following the Battle of Edington. But the north was a different story, because with the Danes fighting elsewhere, the Saxons returned to York. Then both Wulfhere and Egbert were driven out and banished. However, unlike in the south, the Vikings hit back hard. Egbert had been replaced by Rexige, who is swiftly ousted when the Danes return, led by Halfdan Ragnarsson, who promptly destroys all the monasteries. According to Roger of Wendover, the defeated king, Rexige, dies of a broken heart. Halfdan decides he'll be more useful as the king of Northumbria, so takes the title. But Halfdan is also expelled. He dies in Ireland. It appears the next king is Egbert II, but then it's Guthrum, which is where the real story of Viking Jorvik begins. It's hard to tell as much falls into legend and myth when you're dealing with the Vikings. A lot is going on around this time, but you get the gist. And rather than give you a king's list, let's get into York. King Guthrum ends up converting to Christianity. He and Wulfhere become friends. Upon his death, Guthrum apparently was buried under the old Jorvik Cathedral. Despite all the raids and desecration of the Christian goods, it seems that York had remained a Christian religious hub around this time. So much for the legendary heathen army of the pagan Norse. They're all converting, picking up Bibles, attending church, although they're not putting down their axes, and the sea is still in their blood. So, you've got the Kingdom of Jorvik. Anyone who knows anything about the Vikings knows just how much of an international trade route they had. They spanned out all over the world. In fact, they'd spread far enough that a skeleton of a chap with African DNA is found in York. Okay, it's unknown whether it's sub-Saharan African or North African, but what is known is he wasn't born in Africa. He was born in Europe, possibly locally. It certainly opens your eyes. As for this poor woman, who died in her mid-30s, very little is known about her, but she lived in the same area as the previous chap. As for Viking culture, some footage of the boat tour would probably do a better job of putting it in context. than anything I could write. And let's just say, Hollywood has got a lot of explaining to do. Okay, minor art. When making a costume drama, say set in the Victorian era or Georgian, just look at Pride and Prejudice. The costumes are perfect. So why on earth can't they treat the early medieval in the same way? Or any medieval for that fact. We know how Vikings dressed. We know how they lived, what they ate, what they drank. They are not a bunch of mead-swilling barbarians with facial tattoos, leather armour and haircuts straight from an Amon Amarth video. Okay, yes, they liked mead, but also ale and wine. Lots of wine. Imagine that next time you picture Ragnar Lothbrok, a clean-cut nobleman with tunic and cloak, drinking fine wines and observing medieval table manners. Rant over. Just look at their jewellery. It's nothing short of breathtaking. They enjoyed beauty as much as you, alright? And trust me when I say those shoes are comfortable and perfectly suited to the outdoors. I'll also add that those belts would last a good while. Proper handmade leather, no mucking about. The Vikings knew what they were doing. And if you want an idea of the kind of place that the jeweller lived, here's some archaeology. As you can see through the glass floor, buildings are still wooden affairs. Although this particular one is a little bit more well off than the neighbours, no doubt due to their profession. It would be nice to think though that a piece of the jewellery I showed a moment ago was made in this very place. You never know. This would have been a part of a busy street, filled with the hustle and bustle of trade. Carts going back and forth, and the noise of merchants hawking their wares. You can just imagine it. Next door was a toolmaker, and these people would have lived here with their families. Yes, the houses were small, not much to move around in, but you spent most of the time outside. With no gadgets and no want to sit around twiddling your thumbs. Remember, as I said, the Vikings were hard-working people, as were the Saxons. They would have loved the outdoors. Here, in a yard, were found the remains of many mass-produced bits of broken pottery. The maker was literally churning them out. Also, it was where you laid your waste, if you get my drift. But small pigs were kept here, just to keep the mess to a minimum. Tradesmen would have passed down their knowledge to their sons, and then to their sons. Generations of potters, smiths, weavers and bakers. Already it's looking less like a bunch of raiders going around on ships, taking slaves and trashing relics. These are settlers, regular people like you and I, hailing from seafaring stock, and the Riveroos would have taken their ships across Northumbria, not on raiding, but trading, travelling. The Vikings in York were no stranger to good customs and far-off lands like Byzantium, or the lands of the Islamic world. They used silks, even imported wine from the Rhineland. Good old German stuff for the Norsemen. Day-to-day life wasn't just about hard work and toil. There was play. Games like Nine Men's Morris were highly popular. Dice games. They had music. And no, none of that Mongolian throat singing. That's only in the movies and heavy metal songs and things. These are not barbarians. Though I can imagine old Sven sitting around the docks, telling tales of raids in years gone by. Though, by now, these were tales of his grandfather. Good tales of the sea. They never gave up their roots. Their diets reflected this, as delicacies like oysters were available to pretty much everyone. Countless shells have been found littered about all over the place in York. They had a good fish diet, among other things, but goes to show that they still had their Norse roots. They brought these with them, like any immigrant would. Thor's hammers are found at the same time Christians preach from pulpits. So maybe it's time to stop calling them Vikings. Though the word itself has murky origins. We tend to take the meaning as raider from the Northlands, but it could easily mean village or bay. So maybe they are still Vikings after all. These were no raiders. That was long in the past. They worked hard for a living, producing goods that would be sold locally, as well as over the vast territories that the Norsemen claimed. No vast empire ruled from a central point, but many kings, all with their own domains, and one of these domains was York, the centre of Northumbria. And the Vikings were not having an easy time running the place in the larger political arena. You see, the Saxons still hadn't got the message that they were not in charge, and kept pushing back against the Norse rulers. Even so, York is becoming more and more a Viking city. Wrested to and fro over the years, the Saxons are not letting it go, but it's pretty much Viking. There was also trouble with the pagan Vikings, who had no intention of picking up a Bible and a cross, as well as other Vikings from Dublin, like Ragnar Imur, who was both Celtic and Norse, and a pagan. He's currently King of York. But he only lasts 3 years before getting a shoeing from Edward the Elder, the son of Alfred the Great. Edward's the king who conquered the lands known as the Danelaw, a territory south of Northumbria. Here, that woke the Vikings up. He's already put down a Saxon revolt from Ethelwald. He's already utterly beaten the Vikings at Tattenhall. He's united Wessex and Mercia. Now he's got East Anglia. Pretty much rids the south of all Viking control. He's dominating the place. And now he's just overthrown the pagan Northumbrian king. Edward is the closest we've got to a king of England at this point, whether the Vikings like it or not. He's pretty much unified Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia and Northumbria, something his father Alfred only dreamed of doing. His son is Edmund the Magnificent. Yeah, so magnificent he died while trying to rescue his steward from a thief. A blatant assassination. He was only 25. And I will add that all these kings in this period all die within 15 years of each other, are all sons of Edward the Elder. Back to York. The Vikings are not beaten yet. They've got a king, Ragnar Guthfrithson, and he's ruling the Viking North. But he's possibly killed by Saxons. Yeah, he's right. Between these two factions, they're as bad as the bloody Romans. Can someone please just stay on the throne for like 5 minutes without getting killed? Would be nice. Yeah, the bugger was, Edmund the Magnificent was succeeded by Eadred, who immediately turns his attention to York and Northumbria. He's King of England, not Wessex, and Northumbria is in England whether the Vikings understand it or not. This is the period also of Eric Bloodaxe, a Viking lord who drops in and out of York's history, claiming control now and then. He's quite a character, and was briefly the King of Norway, until forced out by the Norwegians. He's only in England because he was forced out. He's now in Northumbria. Why not claim this throne? Yeah, Eadred makes it clear it's a flat no. Eadred also punishes the Northumbrians for disobedience. Eric decides to take the Northumbrian throne again, in like the 950s, which was rather silly. After a revolt from the Northumbrians, in which Eric is ousted from the city, he meets Eadred at the Battle of Stainmore and is slain. Possibly heavily outnumbered, possibly falling, axe in hand, surrounded by Saxons. Several sources give several accounts, not all of them heroic. History is often murky. We will never know. Either way, the death of Eric Bloodaxe puts an end to Viking rule in York. But it's still Viking. And from now on, they'll have to bend the knee to Eadred and join the Kingdom of England. And Oswulf, a Viking, becomes the first Jarl of Northumbria. Jarls become the Earls. If you can't beat them, join them. Besides, it's been almost 100 years since the invasion. York is a Viking city. It's merely put down the axe against the Saxons and joined this new fledgling England. Trade still continues. These are the glory years. And in 1066, it will all come crashing down when the King of England, Edward the Confessor, dies, and 3 kings claim the crown for themselves.